I've always struggled with finding time to manage my finances. At the end of a busy week, the last thing I want to do is spend time budgeting all of my expenses or tracking down customer service teams to cancel old subscriptions I no longer use. But now I use Rocket Money, and it does all that for me. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that finds and cancels your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. Stop wasting money on the things you don't use. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions by going to rocketmoney.com/Washington Post. That's rocketmoney.com/Washington Post.
So, Marianna and Aaron, I don't know about you guys. Going into this week, I was prepared for a big political week. I knew Vice President Harris was coming out with her running mate pick. I knew there was going to be rallies and lots of stuff to talk about. But what I did not have on my bingo card for this week was presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. copping to the fact that he apparently left a dead bear cub in Central Park for reasons that I continue to not understand.
I love seeing the old tweets from when this happened, I think back in 2014, and people are like, wow, this is bizarre. Like, who could possibly have done this? And then 10 years later, we learned that it is one of the three leading contenders for the presidency, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
I guess bring it on, election cycle. What else do you have to show us? What else is weird?
Welcome to the Campaign Moment on this Friday, August 9th. I'm Martine Powers, co-host of Post Reports.
And I'm Aaron Blake, senior politics reporter and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter. We're also joined this week by Marianna Sotomayor, who's a congressional reporter who covers the House of Representatives here at the Post. Hey, Marianna.
So happy to join you guys.
Thanks for being here.
So today we're going to talk about the presidential race, of course. Vice President Kamala Harris announced her running mate this week. It's Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, and he's getting a warm welcome from Democrats amid heat over his record from the GOP. Plus, we'll hear how the Trump campaign is adapting to its new opponents in this election.
But before we get there, we're going to talk about how all the political drama of the last couple of weeks has shaken out in Congress. And Marianna, that's one of the reasons that we were really excited to have you on the show this week, because you cover Congress. And we know that one of the big factors in President Biden's decision to step out of the race was this growing belief that not only was he going to lose the race for the presidency, but he was going to drag down all these other Democrats in competitive House and Senate races. So right now, with all this excitement around Kamala Harris and then Tim Walz, I'm wondering, are congressional Democrats breathing a huge sigh of relief right now?
A massive sigh of relief. I mean, it is like night and day. When they were on Capitol Hill last month, it was just kind of like The Walking Dead. So many Democrats just didn't know what to say, didn't want to say anything. And if they did speak privately to us, they were just inconsolable at times. And they were just really worried about not just, their own races. Of course, that was a major factor, but it really was the party. What do we do? What do we stand for? And, there were just so many conversations about what role do we play and maybe telling the president to step aside, that once that happened and then everything moved so quickly into Vice President Kamala Harris's corner, there's just this elation.
The way you're describing it, I'm imagining Democrat members of Congress popping bottles inside rooms in the Capitol and having little mini raves or something like that. Probably has not reached quite that level.
Well, now they're back home. Who knows what they're doing?
So then what does this all mean for the current outlook on control of Congress after the election? With all of this enthusiasm, is there a hope that Democrats will hold on to the Senate? And what does this mean for Republicans as they try to hold control of the House?
So it's interesting because a lot of the House Democrats who are in vulnerable seats, and I would also say a lot of the vulnerable senators who are running for re-election, they were always running ahead of Biden, some significantly so. And, during the July month, we would be talking to a number of Democratic campaign strategists, pollsters, and they still wouldn't see the down ballot effect that a lot of Democrats were extremely worried about. And frankly something that even Democratic leaders reportedly told Biden, that, you could eventually drag down our candidates to the point where we completely lose the Senate and no longer have a fair shot at the House. The House is the most flippable, one could say. Currently, House Republicans only have a 4-seat margin. So if Democrats are able to hold on to their seats and win 4 seats, flip 4 seats, they'll have the majority next year. That was starting to disappear. Now, just the fact that more Democratic voters are likely to turn out, they're feeling enthusiastic. Many Democrats feel like they're back in the game. I don't think anyone is going out there being like, yeah, we're definitely going to win it outright, because there is always this feeling of we still are in a tight election.
Which I think is getting lost in some cases, that yes, there's enthusiasm, but this is, again, really a tight race, as you said.
Yeah, and you can make the argument for the presidential election too, right? You're seeing the enthusiasm on the Democratic side. I think that's giving the impression oh my God, Democrats are going to sweep. A lot of this enthusiasm dies down. We're going to, again, start debating, who are these candidates? What are the issues? And it's always just going to turn back into this really tight race on the presidential side and on the congressional side. But at the end of the day, there is this renewed feeling of, okay, Democrats can win this again. A lot of Republicans are concerned actually about the fundraising. Democrats brought in so much money over the last several weeks, an astonishing amount. And at least on the House side, Republicans have made very clear, there were some congressional districts they didn't win during the midterms that are so competitive because Democrats just blew them out of the water when it came to money and fundraising. So it's those little things that are going to ultimately determine what happens in November on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, and I think Mariana's point about how these Senate Democratic candidates were running ahead of Biden, that's so important here. And then in the House, it's harder to differentiate yourself from the top of the ticket. People just don't pay as much attention to these House races, and asking them to split their ticket between a presidential candidate and a House candidate is a little bit more difficult today than it has been in past decades. And so especially I don't think the battle for the Senate has necessarily changed a whole lot, but the battle for the House, which is, again, as Mariana said, so razor thin, having a top of the ticket be more in contention, having this be a closer race and potentially winning is so important to Democrats' hopes of retaking the House.
Though one other reason why House Democrats were in the news this week, and this isn't really related to the presidential race, but I do think it's interesting and worth spending some time discussing. This was the primary defeat of Congresswoman Cori Bush in Missouri. So Bush is from the St. Louis area. She represents the 1st House district there. She's been in Congress for 2 terms, and she was the first Black woman to be elected to this seat. But also she was an early critic of Israel after the October 7th attack. And as a result of that, AIPAC, of course, the pro-Israel lobbying group, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, they poured millions of dollars, I think more than $8 million, into her race. And were trying to boost the campaign of her opponent, Wesley Bell, a prosecutor. And Bell won. Folks might remember that something similar happened a few months ago with Jamal Bowman of New York, the congressman there, who lost his primary in a similar fashion after he had been outspoken in his criticism of Israel and the war in Gaza. So, Marianna and Aaron, I'm just curious, what you make of that. What is the takeaway here from the fact that you're seeing members of the squad losing their primaries essentially over Israel, or at least because of money that is being poured into their races from pro-Israel groups?
I think there's 2 takeaways. And the fundraising here, the money that was poured in was unmatched. So AIPAC...
Especially for a primary, right?
Exactly. AIPAC Super PAC poured in something like almost $9 million into a primary race. You never get that much money in just a primary. And all of that went towards attacking Bush and propping up Wesley Bell. But the interesting thing, and we saw this in the New York race as well, is that they didn't necessarily attack her on her position on the war. It was actually never mentioned. What they did go after was her record on Capitol Hill. And Bush hasn't been able to pass any bills on her own. She has actually missed a significant amount of votes this past term, nearing close to 200 votes. And she is not seen, and I would argue Jamal Bowman as well, given what I've heard from Democrats, including some within the Progressive Caucus, they're not necessarily seen as active lawmakers. They're considered ones. And listen, they have a more activist background. And we have seen many activists come to Capitol Hill, but we've also seen some evolve, right? Like you could argue,
like figure out how to work with each other and work the room and
like we've seen the evolution of Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She has become a little bit more strategic on the Hill. One could also argue Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, right? Like she knew, okay, if I want to stick around, I need to embed myself with the speakership office and leadership offices, right? And that was not necessarily Bush's or Bowman's style.
Yeah, and that's a really important point. Like, there was a lot of thought even after Jamal Bowman's loss in the New York primary, the first big race that AIPAC went even bigger on than in this race, that he was already kind of primed for defeat. And even before that money came in, and AIPAC kind of wanted to send a message or create the narrative that they ousted this member who hadn't been on board with them. And he had a lot of other problems. He pleaded guilty to pulling a fire alarm in the Capitol, losing touch with his district, things like that. But yeah, like these members, like they weren't good candidates and they had other problems that were completely unrelated to their stance on the Israel-Gaza war. But AIPAC going and spending all this money in these races does send a message. Like they've helped oust these two members. It's going to give other members who may not be in line with them some pause about whether they could be the next ones who are going to be targeted with this amount of money. And I think that's kind of the overarching thinking for them to go so big in these two races.
And I guess the last piece of big news for House Democrats this week, which gets us back to the presidential race, is, of course, one of their own is now Harris's running mate. Before Tim Walz was governor, he served in Congress for 12 years. Marianna, what are people like? What is the reaction on the Hill to the fact that Walz is now in the race, and what are people saying about his time in Congress?
House Democrats are loving this. They're loving that one of their own was chosen. And the reason why is because it's a tale as old as time. Most vice presidential picks or presidents were senators. And we've totally seen President Biden obviously served in the Senate for so many years. He is such a Senate guy and so deferential.
Kamala Harris, obviously, former senator.
Exactly.
Wait, so do House or I guess Congress people in general, like, do they feel like they're the ugly stepsister in all this, that they're never picked
literally,
to be the ball of the bride or the
belle of the ball?
Belle of the ball,
yes.
Thank you.
There we go.
Yes, they always feel left out. Like, I've written a number of stories where it's like House Democrats feel left out during negotiations of whatever big bill that Biden wanted to pass. And they're always like, hello, look over here. We also have opinions. Like, please invite us to the party. So they're super ecstatic about this. I think no one more than Nancy Pelosi, who has always historically, regardless of who might be in consideration for VP, has always pushed for whoever was if it was a current or former House person. And this is why they just want to have that connection and that into the White House. And
there's reporting, right, that Pelosi did actually lobby for Walz in this, and that she was back-channeling to Harris's people saying you should pick this guy.
Yeah, during the last week that they were in session, I heard from a number of Democrats that she just walked into the floor and she was like, "Oh, Tim Walz, you remember Tim Walz, remember?" And she actually walked off the floor to take a phone call, and a couple of members overheard her saying, "Hello, Tim." And they were like, "Oh my gosh, is she actually on the phone with him, or is she just spreading his name and hoping to manifest this?" And it wasn't just Pelosi.
A fake phone call with Tim Walz for other people to overhear.
It wasn't just her. There were a number of House Democrats who also worked the phones, tried to tell the campaign, don't sleep on this guy.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that there's been a lot of focus on Walz's record from when, if his time in the governor's mansion, but dating back to his House career, I think they see in Walz somebody who has been able to, survive in a tough area, but not do the things that some of these conservative Democrats have to do and totally back away from the party's platform. And so they may see in him someone who can drive a message and kind of survive politically without abandoning the party principles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll be curious to hear more from that time come out as this race goes on and we hear more stories about his time in Congress. But I do want to get back to this messaging point, Aaron, that you brought up of how Walz is able to kind of strike this balance of being successful in places that also have seen success with Republican candidates and still drive home Democrats' message. So, this has been the first week of real campaigning with Walz and Harris side by side. And we've heard a little bit of what that sounds like. And at this rally at Detroit earlier this week, we heard an example of what the message is coming from the Harris-Walz campaign right now.
What kind of country do we want to live in? A country of freedom, compassion, and rule of law, or a country of chaos, fear, and hate? And the beauty of our democracy, we each have the power to answer that question. We each have the power.
So hearing that, I think you could say that Harris and now Walz, that they're taking this very high-minded approach to the campaign, that everything that they're saying now is really optimistic, buoyed by this sense of kind of palpable joy and like positive vibes that they're getting from other Democrats. But Aaron, you have been writing this week about how you feel like that is a pretty dramatic overstatement of what's happening in this race, and that in some ways
it's not the whole story. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Well, I would talk about the whole story because I think we're going to get into some of the couch stuff, and I think we have to explain the couch to people if we're going to explain the context here of what we're hearing from particularly Tim Walz.
So basically, the theme of like joy and optimism that the Harris campaign is putting forward is kind of a very Obama thing. We had hope and change and things like that.
Mm-hmm. When they go low, we go high.
When they go low, we go high. It was the Michelle Obama saying in 2016 especially. And they have done that, but what we've also seen at the same time is an acknowledgement or a belief, I think, that they need to do things that aren't so high-minded as well. The key one was Tim Walz in his introduction in Philadelphia on Tuesday night, making an allusion to J.D. Vance and the couch. For those who don't know, this is a false...
I can't believe we're going to get into this.
Blame Tim Walz. We have to talk about this now. So there was an ex-user who posted a fake citation from J.D. Vance's book in which J.D. Vance supposedly acknowledged having sexual relations with a couch. I don't know how else to say it. I think we should just say it. And this did not appear in the book. It's false, but liberal people on social media have been having fun with it ever since. And Tim Walz decided to make a reference to this in his introduction on Tuesday.
And I got to tell you, I can't wait to debate the guy.
And it was kind of a vague reference, at least as it was scripted.
That is, if he's willing to get off the couch and show up. So, you see what I did there?
And then he said, you see what I did there, to drive home that this was a very intentional thing. And I actually talked to the Harris campaign about this. A Harris campaign aide told me that the you see what I did there was not part of the script, which I think is interesting. Campaigns do this a lot where they kind of like put something out there, but want to keep plausible deniability that it was totally deliberate, that what they were doing. And so, the kind of middle school cafeteria, like Republican leaders are weird thing. I've also noticed in recent days, especially, that the Harris campaign social media accounts are clipping Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and putting videos out there with pretty misleading text attached to it, like kind of pretending they said something a little bit different than what they said. So it just seems like Democrats have kind of warmed to the idea that they need to embrace some of these tactics that they think Republicans have been getting away with for so long. They need to kind of embrace the dark arts in certain ways. And
because I feel like the couch comment to me, it just felt very Trumpian, right? Of like taking something that's definitely not true, like a complete falsehood, but then like mocking your opponent based off something that's not true. And there's plenty to like attack Vance and Trump about based on things that are true or things that they actually did or actually said.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of whataboutism. Like, what about Trump? And there's no question that Trump has plumbed new depths in our politics in ways that go well beyond the couch joke. But this is a shift for Democrats. This is not what they used to do. This is not Michelle Obama's they go low, we go high. They're referring to something that's a very lewd and false thing. And the potential impact of that is that people are going to potentially believe that this is a real thing. And so it is a significant development that the Democratic Party is willing to go to these places. They feel like they've been pushed in them because Republicans have done such more severe things. But it is a notable evolution in how Democrats are running their campaigns.
All right, we're going to take a quick break there. Then we'll come back, do some quick fact-checking of Governor Walz's background. Then we will turn to Donald Trump and how he was responding to a race that is much closer than it was a few weeks ago. We'll be right back.
Hey, I'm Christina Quinn, the host of Try This from The Washington Post. Each Try This audio course gets you closer to solving some of the biggest everyday challenges we face as humans. Things like how to sleep better, how to have more meaningful relationships, and how to enjoy cooking more. We're releasing new courses all the time, where you can learn to be a better functioning human without the time commitment. Find our collection of courses by searching Try This wherever you listen to podcasts.
All right. So while all of this excitement has been going on the Democratic side of things, there are a few pieces of Tim Walz's personal and professional history that are being reexamined and in some ways being used by Republicans to attack him. And really briefly, because there's a lot that we still want to get through, but I just want to run through some of the pieces of his background that we're hearing come up, do a little bit of fact checking so that as this race goes on, we can do a good job of separating fact from fiction. And let's start with his military record. Aaron, unpack a little bit of what actually is going on here.
Tim Walz served 24 years in the National Guard. He deployed overseas in support of the Afghanistan war. But there are three kind of key things that have come up here. One is that Walz has claimed he has cited weapons of war that I carried into war while talking about gun control. He is not a combat veteran, according to everything we know. He served in Italy, apparently in support of the Afghanistan war. The second is that he retired in 2005, shortly before his unit wound up being deployed to Iraq. Republicans have been raising questions about whether he did that intentionally to avoid a deployment. I think it's important to note that he had decided around this point to run for Congress for the first time. So that's the second one. The third one, and I think the big one, is he has at times, and his allies have called him a, quote, retired command sergeant major. And he did serve in that role, but it was a provisional one, and he actually retired at a rank that was lower than that because he didn't complete the paperwork to have that be his retired rank. So he actually retired at master sergeant rather than command sergeant major. The Harris campaign has updated their description of this for him. I think on this last one, there's real questions about why aren't they more careful about this? Politicians.
Because there are these accusations of stolen valor here, right?
Yeah. So J.D. Vance is calling it stolen valor. I think I saw the Wall Street Journal editorial board basically suggested that's an exaggeration, even as there's some significant questions about this. But certainly, using a rank that you didn't actually retire at and isn't accurate is not a great thing for the Harris campaign.
A few other things about Walz that are coming up now as well. There was a 1995 drunk driving charge that he got in Nebraska when he was a teacher, which he later pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of misdemeanor reckless driving, but, obviously not a great look. And then there have been some attacks on his more recent record as governor and some of the things he advocated for or did or didn't do since 2018. Maybe we can talk a little bit about those things.
There are a lot of progressive policies that Democrats in Minnesota have gotten done despite some very narrow majorities. Like, this has been, the merits of these things aside, this has been a legislative success story that they've been able to push through these things. Universal school lunches, universal background checks, red flag law, things like that are big Democratic policies. But there are a few things that I think are going to come up over and over again. One is the, quote, trans refuge bill that he signed to protect access to gender-affirming care. This is something that Trump has been talking about significantly. His campaign has been going after. Allowing anybody, regardless of citizenship status, to apply for driver's licenses. This is something Republicans have used before. And then lastly, the riots in Minneapolis after George Floyd's murder, where some have criticized Walz for not more quickly dispatching the National Guard, is going to be a big one as well. I will point out this week that ABC News and others have pointed to an example of Trump actually praising Tim Walz for his response and for dispatching the Guard, and there's a recording of that.
3 days later, I spoke to the governor. The governor is, I think, on the call, and he's an excellent guy. And I said, you got to use the National Guard in big numbers. They didn't at first, then they did. And I'll tell you that, I don't know what it was. It was, Governor, it was the third night, fourth night. Those guys walked through that stuff like it was butter.
We see Trump actually saying Tim Walz did good things, and so I think that kind of undermines that attack significantly. But those are going to be the flashpoints when it comes to Tim Walz's record as governor.
Marianna, how much do you think this kind of stuff is going to stick?
It's interesting because, sometimes you talk to a couple of political operatives and they say, well, when has the VP really made a massive difference? Obviously, they point to 2008, John McCain, Sarah Palin. But it was different because Sarah Palin was way more outspoken, dynamic. Mm-hmm. So, some people say the VP doesn't really affect the outcome of the race. But of course, there's still going to be people, and we already are totally seeing it by Republicans who are very much pointing out moments in Walz's governor record. But he's so different when he was in the House. He was much more of a centrist, and Republicans will say that. I've talked to a couple who used to serve with him who point out he was just such an affable guy. Like, he would coach the congressional football team, and they say, he's the same guy on the field as he was in the hallway. Like, that was kind of his secret power to negotiations on big issues that matter to his district. He was on the Agriculture Committee, obviously the top Democrat at one point of the Veterans Affairs Committee, and also served on Armed Services while he was in the House. And he was able to bridge a lot of divides simply because of the nature of representing a swing district. And that is something that a lot of Democrats are pointing to. He's been able to work with Republicans. His first attempt at negotiations is to try and make it bipartisan. And he just knows how to speak to people from a very swingy district.
Interesting. So before we wrap, I do want to turn a bit to Donald Trump and how he is navigating this moment in the campaign. Because, we've talked on the podcast over the last couple of weeks that he is now facing an opponent that he was not planning to have be his opponent until recently. And that has required a change in tactics. And you're seeing Trump and Vance trying to figure out what their strategy should be going forward. Aaron, talk to me a little bit about what we've seen from this week from Trump and from his campaign and what they're throwing at the wall here.
Yeah, my colleagues Josh Dawsey and Michael Shearer did a great story on this week, basically about how the Trump campaign is frustrated right now. They quoted Trump saying to an ally in a phone call, quote, "It's unfair that I beat him," being Biden, "and now I have to beat her too." They've made clear that they're not
totally what that means because he did, the election hadn't happened yet, so he didn't beat him.
I think it doesn't make sense, but I think it gets at something that we've seen in lots of his other comments, which is just the idea that this is unfair that she can replace him because they felt like they were in such a good position against Biden. And they've made it abundantly clear that they preferred Biden as their opponent, no matter what they say publicly. And so,
yeah, of course.
We saw months and months of Democrats fretting about how they were doing. And now it's kind of shifted over to the Republican side a little bit.
So if I can just add, there's only so much that a campaign operation can do versus what the candidate does. Mm-hmm. And we have really seen Trump just revert to old Trump and attack Harris on who she is. I mean, last week when he said, she just turned into a Black woman, that was incredibly offensive and very blatant. And now,
and not really an example of the discipline that people were hoping, or people in his campaign, and I think Republicans were hoping that he would show at this point.
Exactly.
In the race.
And during his press conference, saying Kamala Harris is dumb, and just like
and this is the press conference that took place on Thursday, correct?
Yes, during that press conference, he just goes after her instead of necessarily debating the policies or saying, oh, she's so liberal. We didn't see that kind of framing of Biden, except for calling him Sleepy Joe, right? He's been saying that for many years. And that is where you see so many Republican strategists being like, man, this could be easy. If he could just stick to pointing out to her liberal record, oh, she's a San Francisco liberal. This could be easy, but he keeps just stepping on his own toes, and we can't control him from doing that.
This is such an important point, I think. A lot of the Democratic concern about Biden wasn't just that he projected as being old and that was concerning to voters. It was also that he was just kind of incapable of driving a message. He wasn't out there enough and he wasn't on his toes enough. And I think we see that with Trump too. He's never been terribly comfortable talking about policy details. He has talking points that he kind of goes back to when he's asked a question. But in this Thursday press conference, there was not a diving into specifics about the Harris and Walz records that are too liberal. It was a lot of kind of platitudes and nonsensical answers. And to some extent, you need your standard bearer to be able to drive that message. You can't just rely upon your campaign to do these things, because the candidate themselves needs to enunciate these things in ways that they're going to penetrate more.
One other piece of, I think, relevant news that came out of this press conference on Thursday, though, was that Trump appeared to agree to actually have a debate with Kamala Harris, which seems like it was up in the air for a little while. He was saying he didn't want to do it with ABC and that he would only do it with Fox News. And but it seems like now he is ready to do a debate on September 10th with ABC and Kamala Harris. But I think one thing that I've learned over the past 6 weeks is that debates don't really matter and certainly don't change the course of the election. So
I think this is a key point here, and I think it kind of speaks to the dynamics of the race. Just 5 days before Trump's press conference, he basically said he was pulling out of the ABC debate, and he said he would do a September 4th debate on Fox, or he wouldn't do a debate at all. And then 5 days later, he turns around and just agrees to the ABC News debate and proposes more debates. I think that speaks to kind of how they feel the need to change the narrative here and do something about this. That was an acknowledgement, if there ever was one, that this race has shifted in Harris's favor. Pretty much every recent national poll shows Harris ahead, albeit within the margin of error, and the margins of error are important here. We've seen polls miss things before. We still have a close race. It is a much more competitive race. And so I think we've seen kind of a recasting of the map, and the race has become a little bit bigger now because we have what appear to be 6 toss-up states again.
And so as all of this is playing out, Marianna, what are some of the questions that you're going to be asking going forward, especially as we're looking at these polls and seeing how the race shifts?
I mean, I want to see any kind of polls that might be done on the down ballot races, right? Are Democrats still running ahead of Harris now? Are they way stronger? I mean, that's kind of the things that I'm looking at is how does the presidential affect all of the Capitol Hill races? And now that voters are tuning in, how is that going to help either Republicans or Democrats in the House and the Senate?
Good questions. All right, I think we have to leave it there. Marianna, thank you so much for being here with us.
Of course. So happy to join you guys. This is fun.
I'm glad you think it was fun. Marianna Sotomayor is a congressional reporter covering the House of Representatives for The Post, and Aaron Blake is a senior political reporter and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter.
And don't forget to subscribe to the Campaign Moment newsletter. You can find a link in today's show notes. That's it for this week on the Campaign Moment. If you're listening to this episode via Post Reports and you are not yet subscribed specifically to the Campaign Moment podcast feed, now would be a great time to fix that. In addition to these Friday episodes, On the Campaign Moment podcast, we're bringing you conversations and dispatches throughout the week so you can stay up to date on all the latest in the 2024 election. So make sure that you are also following the Campaign Moment podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Today's episode was produced by Laura Benshoff with help from Trinity Webster-Bass. It was mixed by Rennie Svirnovskiy. It was edited by Allison Michaels, Lucy Perkins, and Mary Jo Murphy. Our team also includes Maggie Penman, Rena Flores, Monica Campbell, Ted Muldoon, Alana Gordon, Ariel Plotnick, Bishop Sand, Sabby Robinson, Emma Talkoff, Sean Carter, Peter Bresnan, Ali Bianco, Renita Jablonski, and Alahe Azadi. And I am Martine Powers.
And I'm Aaron Blake.
Aaron, I will see you next week.
I'll look forward to it.
Bye.
Hey, I'm Christina Quinn, the host of Try This from The Washington Post. Each Try This audio course gets you closer to solving some of the biggest everyday challenges we face as humans. Things like how to sleep better, how to have more meaningful relationships, and how to enjoy cooking more. We're releasing new courses all the time, where you can learn to be a better functioning human without the time commitment. Find our collection of courses by searching Try This wherever you listen to podcasts.